And so with that, let's get started because I'm sure everybody wants to dive in. And, it is my pleasure to actually thank Peter Singer and welcome Peter Singer, who is here joining us via video from Geneva. I think you all can see Peter there. Peter, thank you for joining us from Geneva. I think many of you know Peter. Peter is a former Chief Executive Officer of Grand Challenges Canada and is currently Professor of Medicine at University of Toronto, Director of the Sandra Rotman Center at University Health Network, and Foreign Secretary of the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences. He's a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences, and the U.S. National Academy of Medicine, and the Academy of Sciences for Developing World. And of course, as you all know, since earlier this year, Peter has served as Senior Advisor to Dr. Tedros, the Director General of the World Health Organization. So Peter, I will turn it over to you. Peter will speak for 15 minutes, and then we'll have 15 minutes of Q&A. Peter.
Thank you very much, Seema, for that very warm introduction. It's particularly humbling for me to be able to speak with such a large amount of old friends in the room who I see on the video, and also as a foreign associate of the National Academy of Medicine, I'm always very happy and prepared to serve. I'm now full-time at the World Health Organization as the special advisor to the Director General, and so that's the capacity in which I'm speaking to you, but I will draw upon my earlier experiences and I'll highlight where that's the case. Also, if you don't mind, Seema, just want to introduce my colleague, Gaudens Silberschmidt, who's there in the room. Gaudens is just waving, and he will, we've coordinated, he'll have very many complimentary remarks, and since he's been there much longer and is more knowledgeable than I, he will also help fill in and correct some of the things that I have to say. I want to organize my remarks actually very much along the lines of your objectives. I'll talk first about the value proposition, secondly, some models, thirdly, tackle the issue of innovation, and fourthly, speak to the challenge, which is going to turn into an opportunity at the end of the remarks. In terms of the value proposition, I think we all have the same principal value proposition, and that is saving and improving lives. The many people from industry that I've met actually don't vary in that. Of course, you need to do that on a financially sustainable model, maybe even a profitable model, but I think our value proposition is the same. And I'm really glad as I looked at the framework for your workshop that the focus has shifted from the if to the how, because that's really where the work needs to be done. I think everybody recognizes, and this is to some extent formalized in the partnerships SDG 17, that the challenges we face together in global health are too big to be solved by any one sector alone. They can't be solved alone by the government sector. They can't be solved alone by the private sector. They can't be solved alone by the by civil society. And so we need to find ways to work together to essentially improve global health. So that's really all I wanted to say in terms of the value proposition, and I'll be a little bit more specific when I get into the models and into the issues of innovation. But I think we're all moving towards the same objective, and that's really the principal point I want to make. And that's a great starting point for discussions. And it's not always the starting point for discussions, which is why I want to put that so explicitly. It's also not uniform, of course, across the private sector. WHO, Dr. Tedros has expressed that he wants to engage with all sectors, but of course, and Gaudens will talk more about the framework for engagement with the non-state actors, which is essentially the rules of engagement. There are limits to that at WHO. The tobacco industry, arms manufacturers, et cetera, would be outside of those limits and outside of the comments that I'm making. The second part I wanted to just touch briefly on is some specific examples of models of cooperation. And the way I thought might be helpful to do that is WHO has recently developed a new strategy called a General Program of Work. It's the 13th General Program of Work. It has in it something called the triple billion target. And I just wanted to explain that briefly and then look at the points where the private sector might interact with the various elements of that. Because in some sense, the World Health Organization covers world health, and that's not a bad tableau against which to look at the spectrum of models. And that's what that description will give us. Before I go much more deeply into that, just raise your hands if you've heard of this triple billion target or WHO's new General Program of Work. It'll determine the extent to which okay, so about half the people have, including Gaudens. And the triple billion target is actually the focus of the 13th General Program of Work. This was a new strategy brought in by Dr. Tedros a year ahead of schedule. You know, he started just over a year ago, and it is a quantitative target, and it says that over the 5 years of the strategy, WHO will work towards, and these are joint goals with partners and countries, member states, towards seeing 1 billion more people benefiting from universal health coverage, 1 billion more people better protected from health emergencies, and 1 billion more people enjoying better health and well-being through the multi-sectoral interventions, and I'll describe some of those in a second. So we have the triple billion target, and of course that requires some enabling functions like data and innovation, and I'll come to those in a moment as well. That's a way of thinking about WHO's overarching strategy, and they're ambitious goals, they're joint goals, but we're gearing up to achieving them, and the strategy starts on January 1st and goes to 2023. If you go into those buckets, though, you really see examples across the board and different types of models of engagement with the private sector. This is a WHO perspective, but it also, I think, gives good perspectives of the diversity of models across global health. So, for example, in universal health coverage, part of that is access to medicines, and WHO is helping there with WHO pre-qualification. That essentially is a type of regulatory function. It's a normative function, and you can see many cases where WHO has pre-qualified a medicine or a group of medicines that's improving access. If it's pre-qualifying the second or third medicine, you see the pricing drop comparably in terms of the competitive environment. So pre-qualification is one type of interaction, a kind of quasi-regulatory. A very similar one, again, under universal health coverage, is the issue of essential medicines, where, again, it's a normative function. WHO has an essential medicines list. They now have an essential diagnostics list. And through that normative expert opinion, gleaned from around the world, essentially it is shaping demand for products that meet certain technical quality standards. There's, of course, the whole issue of delivery, where there's intersections, and the issue of antimicrobial resistance, for example. So there's some issues and models in universal health coverage. Similarly, in health emergencies, a good example there would be the pandemic influenza framework. That's the group that comes together normatively, determines the strains of influenza vaccine that will be there next year, and then that information and indeed those strains are then supplied to manufacturers around the world, selected manufacturers, who then produce the world's influenza vaccine. That's another area, and of course there are other in health emergencies. There's a particularly robust interaction in the area of healthier populations. A very archetypal one would be WHO's approach to tobacco control, which is the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. That's essentially an international treaty that then domestic governments sign on to with laws, and that's a strongly influential piece of legislation, and that leads domestic governments then to do things like putting taxes on tobacco, front of package labeling, and things like that. So again, a type of regulatory function. Another example is a recent initiative to eliminate trans fats in food. And that, of course, is also a health promotion, healthier populations, multi-sectoral thing. And the interface there is really around the food industry and engagement in product reformulation. And the type of relationship there between the food industry, WHO, and of course consumer demand really, I think, influences that. On the issue of obesity, you have similar issues with the food industry as well. So some examples in healthier populations where it's an interplay between regulation, consumer demand, and then some technical functions on the part of companies like product reformulation. Finally, I want to hit on the enabling functions: data, innovation, innovative finance. This is, I think, a particularly promising area and one I'd like to go into. Here, you're looking at the data issues behind a lot of the global health issues. And one of the things I've learned, having been here now for just over a year, is actually the importance of data and information to targeting solutions that tackle global health problems. Think about it as precision public health, if you will, a kind of recently popular term, or think about it in whatever terms. But there, whether it's the companies in that domain, or whether it's some of your companies that hold data that might be extremely useful for global health, for example, in the area of antimicrobial resistance, these represent another type of interaction. And then I want to go in more detail the areas of innovation and innovative finance. So far I've made the first of my 2 points related to the value proposition and how we have common objectives, and of course you need to see those on financially sustainable grounds. The second of my points, which was really a broad survey of types of models. You saw some, if you will, prohibitive models where WHO won't engage with the tobacco industry and does what it can working with governments to reduce smoking rates. You saw some other types of interactions, for example, around trans fats, which are, yes, regulatory and obesity, but consumer demand really helps drive what companies do in that area. And then the kind of more vaccine and drug-oriented examples that I gave. And now I want to head into innovation and innovative finance. So that second point was, if you're looking for the scope and scale of models, not a bad place to look is the intersection sets with WHO strategy. And I've just tried to highlight some of them, and Gowden's will highlight some others. The third area I want to talk about is the area of innovative finance and innovation. And some of the experiences I'm going to talk about now don't represent official WHO policies there, but I think their experience is relevant to all of us as we start to think about how we can actually develop innovative models that better approach the goal of us working together, all sectors working together for the benefit of health of people. And I'll do this in 2 sets. One is, there are a number of examples of companies and specific products that have had public-private interactions, mostly on finance, with groups like Grand Challenges Canada, but also USAID, Gates Foundation, et cetera. And what those things have in common, and let me just give you a few of those examples, inhaled oxytocin, which came out of Saving Lives at Birth. That's a GSK collaboration. Putting oxytocin, which stops maternal hemorrhage, in an asthma inhaler, so it doesn't need to be refrigerated and doesn't need to be given by injection. And GSK has those capabilities, and that's a project from Monash University, GSK, funded by various groups, including Saving Lives at Birth historically. That's an example. Another example would be the augmented infant resuscitator and Philips. Of the 5 million children under the age of 5 who die every year, 1 million die on the first day of life. That requires good newborn resuscitation. The techniques there aren't great. Augmented infant resuscitator is a bag and mask that goes over a newborn that shows you with green, yellow, red stop signs the quality of the resuscitation. So it's enhancing the quality of clinical care in a sense. the Odon device from Becton Dickinson, which is for assisted vaginal delivery and delayed labor, one of the first innovations in that in a couple hundred years. Satopan from Lixil, which is a simple, cheap toilet technology to help with toilets, and many other examples from many of your companies, be they in technologies, supply chains, and so on. You know, the Merck from others, and the work that J&J does, et cetera. So there's a lot of good examples, but what those examples have in common, I learned, is the following. You think that sometimes people on the public sector side think that what the private sector is about is donating money, but it's actually not that. In all those examples, what those companies are actually doing is acting as a platform for scaling, and scaling in a sustainable manner. The biggest problem that innovation has is actually scaling sustainably, and those companies, especially in the areas of those technologies, and the other companies, are providing a platform for scaling. What the public sector partners are doing, especially the financial partners, is lowering the hurdle rate and sharing the risk for those products, for those companies, by providing, for example, repayable finance, that if the product is successful, they'll share in the return, but if it's not, they've taken on some of the financial risk at the front end when it's often the hardest. So I think that's the model. Of course, the funders are also bringing strategic insights and networks to ultimate funders, because those intermediate funders I described don't carry things to scale. Ultimately, it's domestic governments and procurement and so on that scales things. So I went into more depth in that model related to innovation, particularly of technologies, and what's happening in the interface there. And that's also the same experience, I think, when you're not talking about individual investments, but you're talking about funds that invest in innovation. And a very good example of that is the Global Health Investment Fund. That's a $108 million U.S. Fund that was started by Gates and J.P. Morgan, risk guaranteed by Sweden, and Gates with anchor investments from Germany, KfW, Grand Challenges Canada, others, SIF. And that fund now has made several investments and is showing pretty well the same thing that I described in the individual investments. So I went into that model of innovation and innovative finance in terms of risk sharing and lowering the hurdle rate up front. A lot of lessons learned there in more detail, because I think that's one that could really be built upon in your discussions. Before I move off that model, let me just say again that those are experiences where I'm not talking officially on behalf of WHO, but I think they're relevant to anybody who's interested to growing innovation. And innovation is very much a part of the strategy of the GPW. What it says about innovation in WHO's new strategy is the problem is sustainability and scale, where WHO could really help innovators across the board, be it social innovations and health systems innovations or technological innovations like the ones I was talking about, is to help with sustainability and scale because of its close relationships with countries and its ability to operate at scale. So that WHO position is also consistent with the examples I gave you that came from different situations, if you will. So that was my third point, delving a little bit into specific examples of innovative models. And I know Wendy Taylor is there or will be there, and she has incredible experience in doing very, very similar things, having started Saving Lives at Birth and working on many of the same innovations. Lastly, and in closing, in order to preserve time for Q&A, and I'll just do a little wrap-up in a second, I wanted to get to the issue of challenges. Yes, there are little technical challenges in each of these models. So, for example, you know, in something like if you're setting up an investment fund for global health innovations, you need to determine whether you're going to cap returns or not. And, you know, there's a lot of lessons learned on specific technical things, and I just use that as an example from some of those experiences. But I think the most fundamental challenge, and this takes me back actually to where I started, is the challenge of trust. Trust between the sectors and the ability to work together. I think we're in a very good place on that in terms of being able to build on that. And, I started out by talking about partnerships and SDG 17. What I would say would be maybe just to end with a little simple equation, see if you agree with it or not. SDG 17/partnership, which a lot of people talk about, plus impact, which is what I've really been focusing on a lot at the beginning and throughout the equals trust or builds trust. In other words, I think the enabling environment is there now with SDG 17 and the SDGs to facilitate partnerships across sectors. I think you're learning about the models, but I think nothing encourages success like success. And success on some of these models, like the ones I talked about in the more general overview with respect to WHO, where many of those are actually very successful, or success on the specific innovative models, for example, and success measured in terms of lives saved and improved is ultimately what's going to build trust, which will create the virtuous cycle. I know that people think a lot about the corporate activities, and a lot of those models have to do with that. I'm particularly interested in what the investment side of companies can do and what investments in global health can do, because I see a lot of upside opportunities there in terms of the amount of private capital that is not being used necessarily towards promotion of SDGs or SDG 3 that could. And that's easier said than done, but something that I think we might all focus on. So in summary, I really made 4 points. Firstly, I just started from the position that we share a common goal. And you're looking at industry's value proposition. I think the top line of industry's value proposition, or the top item, shall we say, is the same as the value proposition of every sector, which is to save and improve lives. And then we each approach it slightly differently from our perspective, and yours, of course, is financial sustainability and profitability. Secondly, I tried to sketch the diversity of models by linking that or looking at that through the lens of WHO strategy and its triple billion target. And of course, what you see in the first and second points is definitely a willingness on the part of WHO to engage with all sectors, because the key to that strategy is impact for people at the country level. How the engagement occurs is governed by FENSA, the framework for engagement with non-state actors that Gaudens will describe in detail, but I think there certainly is a willingness to look at partnerships that yield results that benefit people, that serve the strategy of impact for people at the country level. Thirdly, I delved more deeply into some of the models on innovation and innovative finance, because I think those are particularly promising. And I don't know the extent to which those will play in your discussions. And again, that's consistent with WHO strategy on innovation, and some of the examples came from elsewhere. And then finally, on the challenges, I think it's really a challenge of trust building, where you've got the enabling platform with SDG 17, but the key factor is really results. And the more lives we save and improve together, the more appetite I think there will be to double down and enhance partnerships and partnership models. And I think there's particularly a lot of upside opportunity on the investment side. There is, of course, lots of opportunity in very many other places, supply chains that I think Brian Brink will talk about, and occupational health and clinics, which he's done, as I understand, and other areas, and some of the other areas I mentioned. But I see quite a bit of opportunity on the innovation, innovative finance, and investment side, because I think we've only begun to tap that. So I'll pause there, Seema, if that's okay. I hope that hits the mark, and very much look forward to the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Fabulous, fantastic. You've really, really beautifully framed this out for us. So I think we have time for questions, and may I ask, if you have a question, if you could flip your tent cards up that way. Let's see. Questions? There we go. Okay. Scott? Yep.
Thanks, Seema, and thank you, Peter. I'm Scott Ratson. I'm, as you know, a senior fellow at Harvard Kennedy School now. And thank you very much for that. It was a great presentation and putting it very clearly on the strategy that you've mentioned and the ways going forward. So we have our forum that's called the Forum on Public-Private Partnerships for Global Health and Safety. And today we're called Multi-sectoral Engagement in Global Health. So I have a couple of questions for you, Peter, from maybe a personal as well as a WHO perspective per se. On one, first, the use of PPP versus multi-sectoral, or how that's used. And then secondly, yesterday we've been talking about some ideas for guiding principles in other areas. And I have mentioned the Innovation Working Group that, of course, you co-chaired after I did. And I've used that as an innovative model. So I'm wondering if you may be able to reflect on how a model like that, or if a model like that, could work in developing three areas that you've mentioned, whether it's innovative financing, use of digital technology, and of course some of the consumer demand, which you didn't mention in your, you did mention with the obesity piece, but more ways of using marketing for public health.
Thank you, Scott. And Seema, should we take a couple of questions if there are, or I'll just answer Scott's if there's only one?
No, I think why don't we do that? I think that's a good idea. Clarion, you have a question as well? Yeah.
Yes. Again, great talk. I really think you exhibited a great deal of the vision that I'd heard about you. So you've lived up to all your expectations by me. But I'd really like to know 2 or 3 things that keep you up at night. I mean, from your perspective, what are the things that, if you look at 2 or 3 years from now, you'd really be most concerned about?
Great.
Okay. Any other questions? And then if you have questions, there are standing mics around the room as well, so you can go up there and ask questions. All right. It looks like those are the 2 questions. Over to you, Peter.
Great. Well, thank you very much. So it's great to see Scott again, and of course Scott's very knowledgeable in many of the topics we're talking about as well. On the question of the Innovation Working Group for Every Woman, Every Child. So this was associated with the UN Secretary General's office. It was a way to bring innovation into the Every Woman, Every Child discussion. The first 5 years with Tori Goodall and Scott and others really did very important awareness raising about innovation in the context of women and children's health. And then later, we developed the innovation marketplace in the context of the Innovation Working Group. And that was really trying to solve the problem I mentioned before, which is scale and sustainability. The types of problems that was trying to solve was every innovation funder likes more of the stuff they funded before, but we actually should look at stuff across that. Secondly, so it was really a platform. The goal of it was to scale 20 innovations by 2020, but it was a platform where we were evaluating innovations. We were agnostic to their source. We were looking for innovations that can scale. We were trying to entrain private capital. And I think the pluses of that showed that you could set up an evaluative system for innovations linked to an SDG across different funders. And I think that was proven, that concept, largely successfully. I think it also showed, and this is on the minus side, just how hard it is to entrain that private capital that's actually sitting on the sidelines that everyone always talks about, the trillions of dollars. Develop a model to entrain that. We worked originally with UBS in the context of that. It's very hard to develop a model to do that. And it also led to, I think, the concept that a group like WHO has a very important role to play because the problem is operating at scale. The ultimate scaler of these innovations is domestic governments on their own universal health coverage platforms often. And that's obviously the centerpiece of Dr. Tedros's strategy and so on. So it led to a very simple idea, which was, identify the top 10, 15, 20 innovations that are ready to scale, evaluate them, look at the kind of critical path, link them to governments, and work to scale them as something that the World Health Organization could potentially do. That's roughly, I made up some numbers there when I was talking about 10 or 20, but the concept itself is what it says in our strategy. And so, Scott, to the Innovation Working Group question, I think you see the pieces of the puzzle of scaling kind of being addressed piece by piece. And now the last piece is that linkage to domestic governments the best platform to do it, and really seeing some of these innovations scale. Because when you think about it, there's not a lot of innovations that have scaled. It doesn't, put another way, it doesn't take many innovations scaling to make a big difference in global health. Think about, for example, just meningitis vaccine in North Africa, something WHO was involved in along with PATH and Gates and Serum Institute. That made a big difference, one innovation. You get a few innovations going, you can make a big difference. So that kind of thinking around scaling innovations is, I think, where that led. On the issue of consumer demand, I think increasingly there is a mutual interest amongst sectors to shape consumer demand, because ultimately companies that have moved into product reformulation, et cetera, pretty quickly learn that they are disciplined by their shareholders unless they are developing sustainable models. And the way to develop a sustainable model is to shift consumer demand. And so I think it has an extremely important piece to play, and potentially is one where different groups working together can help. And of course, that's health-oriented consumer demand we're talking about to drive things in that direction. Clarion, to your question, this might sound like a funny way to answer that question, but the thing that keeps me up most at night in this particular area that you're working in is ideology. That's what keeps me up at night, because it's ideology that mischaracterizes the other, whether it's the private sector view of the public sector or the intergovernmental sector, which I'm now in, or the public sector view of the private sector or civil society view of one of the other sectors. If you have a deeply entrenched ideological position, you will start from a particular perception that does not facilitate the type of dialogue and partnership that's necessary to harness the opportunities that we face. And those opportunities are only through collective action, a subset of those, like some of the innovations I described. Without all those partners working collectively together, there is no opportunity. I'm not now talking about things like reducing tobacco through framework convention. I'm talking about the growing of the innovations, the way we can get a handle on 5 kilometer square data so we can target malaria solutions exactly to where the malaria cases are. Those are all things that require interaction between the public and the private sector. And the thing that screws that up the most, that most limits that, is starting from an ideological position. So the opposite of that is a type of openness to discussion. Now, having said that, on whatever side, results speak for themselves and behaviors speak for themselves. So from that point on, it's kind of demonstrate you're on proof of concept with your partner and you're building trust with your partner, but not to be able to engage in that dialogue in the first place because of an ideological position. And again, I'm not talking about the tobacco industry and the arms industry where WHO will not engage. I'm talking about the spectrum of other industries like related to data or innovation or even some of these areas like obesity where, groups can work together to achieve those health goals. And that's what keeps me up at night, Clarion. I mean, I could have said a lot of other things but in the context of this workshop, I think that's the thing that really keeps me up at night. And the opposite of that is an openness to engage, to learn, and in a humble way to serve the people we're all interested in. WHO's new mission is to promote health, to serve the vulnerable, and to keep the world safe. And that mission cannot be accomplished without dialogue. And I think what you see in WHO now, and certainly with Dr. Tedros, is a humility and an openness to engage and to listen, and then of course to partner under those rules of engagement that I mentioned that Gaudens will describe. So, Clarion, that might be kind of a weird answer to your question, but that's what really keeps me up at night, because it's the opportunity space that you have. This room, the room you're in and the people you're with represent an unbelievable opportunity for improving global health.
Sir, that was the
The
perfect
thing that'll
answer.
stand in the way is, yeah.
That was
Thank
the
you.
perfect answer on a couple of fronts, because often the first stage that I have failed on many occasions was getting people to the table. But if they didn't have the right ideology, then it didn't go anyplace. So that's incredibly important.
Yeah.
And one other question, just I have to ask, as populations change and shift and people move from the country to the cities, do you see your role changing in any way in that?
Yes. I think the answer to that question is yes. I mean, that implicates all kinds of health shifts. But I think that a coherent well, let me put it this way. So WHO is an intergovernmental organization, and its governing body, if you will, is the health ministers of the world. And Gowdens knows much more about this as a former Swiss diplomat, and he'll talk to you about health diplomacy aspects.
You're putting a lot of pressure on him.
Yeah, that's good. I'm just building him up. He's a good guy. I talked to him at the coffee break. But the point I wanted to make is let's not forget the subnational governments and the municipal governments, for example, which is cities, which is where a lot of the action is. Now, what I've seen here at WHO is there are some cities activities, and many partners have them as well. You know, the Healthy Cities Network, in the aging area, there's a particular focus on age-friendly cities. But what I haven't seen yet is us pulling all that activity together across thematics and across sectors to really use the platform of cities to deliver health. Many of the effects we're talking about in terms of regulation of smoking in bars, for example, and restaurants happen at the municipal level. But I think there is an opportunity to do a systematic look, whether it's aging, whether it's NCDs, whether it's air pollution, whether it's obesity. All these things are very closely related to city issues, and pulling them together comprehensively, I think, could be very useful, because they all, or many of them, also have public and private sector elements. So maybe that can be a focus for your further discussion, the kind of lens of cities as a model of partnerships across sectors. And really what you're looking for is where's the biggest leverage. You know, none of our lives are limitless, so what we're all looking for is where you want to invest your time. And that's why I landed on the innovation and innovative finance. I think that's that's an area that's particularly ripe for growth in global health. But another area is the one you raised, Clarion, which is the municipal cities lens, and building a platform on which these things operate not independently alone, but also more systematically together, and the different sectors, public and private, can build that together. Thank you.
Thank you. And although she couldn't be here today, Joe Ivy Buford is smiling someplace right now, okay, after what you've just said. Are there any other questions? Okay, well, first of all, I'd ask our group here to give you another round of applause for just a spectacular, and as we say, you hit it out of the park in sports parlance. Thank you so very much.
Well, thank you, and you're very kind, and I feel very humbled because I see who's there in the room, and many of you know much more about these issues than I do, and I really just wish you the best for your deliberations, because, you know, to your point, Seema, at the beginning, there is a ton of upside opportunity here of the people in the room if you really focus in on the how, and you prioritize and you find the highest levers, or the highest leverage points where we can all work together for the benefit of those who we serve. Thank you.
Thank
have
you.
a very productive meeting.
Bless you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.